On today's show, we're answering questions submitted by you. Welcome to the show where we tackle the tough questions submitted by installers, technicians, foremen, project managers, estimators, IT people, and even customers. We are connecting at the human level so that we can connect the world. If you're watching this show on YouTube, would you mind hitting the subscribe button or the bell button to be notified when new content is being created? If you're listening to us on one of the audio podcast platforms, would you mind giving us a 5-star rating? Those two little steps helps us take on the algorithm so we can get the message of educate, encourage, and enrich to all the people in the ICT industry. Thursday nights, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. What are you doing? I do a live stream on TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn where you get to ask your favorite RCDD your questions about design, installation, certification, estimation, project management, even career path and certifications. But I can't Chuck, I'm driving my truck at 6 p.m. on Thursdays. I can't watch. I'll get in a crash and lose my job. That's okay. They are recorded and you can watch them on our website at letstalkcabling.com. Finally, while this show is free and will always remain free, it does cost money to produce this. If you would like to help support this platform, you can look us up on Patreon. You can go to the website and go through our Amazon links. You can even go to the link tree through this QR code right here. You can buy me a cup of coffee and even schedule a 15-minute one-on-one Zoom call with me. This is a first for this episode. I've been doing it for 2 years, but I put out some feelers because people were starting to ask me some questions, and I started to see a theme. A lot of the people who listen to the show, I have two major audiences. I have those who installs and those who are just starting their companies. So I got a lot of people who are just starting their companies that reached out to me and said, Chuck, we're having problems finding qualified candidates or the process to select the best candidate. So I had everybody submit some questions so I can bring on a subject matter expert to help us tackle these questions. I might do more of these in the future, depending on how well this does. So if you have some questions, I'm working on one now on union versus non-union. I got a bunch of union people volunteer to talk, but I need some non-union people to volunteer to come on the show for that episode. And we can have a civilized conversation of union versus non-union. But getting back to this one, a lot of new business owners, again, people who just all of a sudden said, well, you know what? I can have my own cabling company because it's just installing cable. But then when they start getting on the business side, they realize, wow, this is a little bit more involved. And they find that one of the biggest problems that they have is selecting the right candidate to work with them. It's not as easy as you think. Sometimes your brother is not the best choice. Sometimes your best friend is not the best choice. So I had everybody submit me some questions so that we can talk about this. And again, I'm bringing on one of my subject matter experts, someone whom that I know personally and I have broken bread with at my house. So welcome to the show, Robleh Kirce. How you doing, Robleh?
Doing great. Good to see you, Chuck. How are you?
Good to see you too. I was just telling the audience how we've broken bread. You've actually had some of my famous barbecue.
This is true. And if I recall, I also lost a foot race to like an 8-year-old or something. So, it was the best of times and the worst of times.
That's okay. That 8-year-old has also lost a race to my German Shepherd. So, hey.
You win some, you lose some.
Exactly right. So for those who don't know you, can you just give us like a 30-second, 1-minute thing, who you are and your experience as to why we should listen to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Robleh Kirce. My background is in industrial organizational psychology. This is a field that really the origin point was trying to figure out who we should put in what positions for World War II. So it's a field that's kind of dedicated not exclusively to selection process and hiring process, but certainly a good match for it. Beyond that, I've done selection tests or hiring tests for everything from like chief of police to chief people officers, all sorts of stuff. So, been doing it for a long time. Done it in the tech world, done it in the city government, done it in a lot of places. So, happy to talk about it.
Very cool. So, my audience has two major sections, right? The one section are the people who are kind of new to the industry and they want to learn the technical side. And then the other one are people who've been doing the technical side, but now they want to advance and start their own company. And then they quickly realize while they know how to pull, terminate, and test cable really well,
Mhm.
when it comes to soft skills, like people skills, hiring is not always the it's not always as easy as you think. I said in the intro, sometimes hiring your brother's not the right choice, as much as you may love your brother, right?
Uh,
Um,
100%. Yeah.
exactly. So I have about 7, 8 questions that were submitted to me, and the first one's going to talk about the lack of qualified candidates, right?
Mhm.
So the question that was submitted says, "How can I find a higher quality candidate? When I post a job, I get flooded with responses, the majority of which lack the qualifications."
Yep. Yep. Definitely get that. And worth saying that there are worse problems. Like the worst problem is you do a post and you get nothing back. And for me, this is it's like the best metaphor is like is fishing. If you can think this right, like now personally, I've never been much of a fisher. I caught a rock fish, when I was like 10, and that was the pinnacle of my career. But if someone's going fishing, the first problem is like I didn't catch any fish. Right, there's nothing out there. Second problem is like, okay, I caught fish, but they weren't big enough, right? And then sometimes fish are actually too big, right? So you can have all different types of problems. The first thing I always tell people is think about like where you're actually looking for the fish. Or in this case, we're not going to eat the people, right? But maybe we eat the fish. Maybe we put the fish back. I don't know. But you want to know where you're looking. Now, this is different for every industry, right? But if I'm looking for fish and I'm looking for moose, those are two very different animals. I'm going to be looking two very different places. Then I'm going to use different baits, right, or different incentives to come in and have a conversation with me. So what I'm actually posting is going to give you a second level there, and then third, trying to screen out like what do you not want, right? And if you're not putting those three things in context, there's a good chance you're going to miss the ideal candidate. Where are you doing postings? What are you saying I need, and what are you saying you're not looking for? And those three criteria are going to handle most of your problems.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So I'm in all kinds of different social media groups, right? There's actually one social media group called, so if I remember the name of it, Low Voltage Nation Jobs. That might be a good place to put an ad instead of just putting one out on Craigslist or one of the other boards. And another one is another Facebook group called Low Voltage Technicians or something like that. They have a lot of job
Mhm.
things there too. So what I'm thinking is they're kind of somewhat qualified, and that might help that process. That was just my
Yeah.
thought.
Try to
So
try to go to where your ideal candidates are already going and
right,
communicate with them. And the other thing here is sometimes you just if you go back to the fishing, you hire a charter boat, right? They know exactly where the fish is, they tell you what bait to use, all that. You can hire a recruiting firm, I assume, probably in this industry as well.
right.
You've got folks that this is all they do.
And here's another thing I'll point out too, as well, is when you're screening all those candidates, just because you think that somebody may not have the qualifications, that doesn't mean that they can't do the job. And let me just tell you a real quick story of
Mhm.
one time when I was hiring some technicians for a project that I was running. It was a state of the art thing. It was the first. It was the first video on demand way back in like the 90s before we started doing the streaming that we have now. So I was hiring a bunch of technicians to do the work. And this one guy came in. He's an old guy at the time. He must have been, I don't know, 58. Now I'm his age. And so we were talking, and I just, he must have gotten the feeling that I was brushing him off. And I think I was. And then at the end of the interview, he goes, "I'm not going to get this job, am I?" And I said, "Yeah, you're not. I don't think it's a good match." And he goes, "Well, all we're really doing is this, 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 and this." And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, I can easily do that." He says, "Take a chance on me." And I
Mhm.
did.
Mhm.
And that guy ended up being the best and the quickest technician I had of everybody. And I almost passed him up because his skill sets didn't exactly line up with what I envisioned, you know.
Mhm.
That just kind of goes to show how sometimes our bias comes into play sometimes, and sometimes we may rule out somebody. Our company uses a team approach to hire people. Initial screening is done by HR, and then followed up by the screening by the HR by the hiring manager. This has resulted in a bias in the selection process and has led to overlooking qualified candidates, like I just was saying.
Mhm.
How can we improve this process to get the best candidate for the job?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with the structure of how they're doing that hiring process. They're doing kind of a tiered, or maybe call it gated or a phased hiring process, where people pass one interview with one person and they move on to another interview and interview maybe with somebody else or different department. Inherently, nothing wrong with that. Um, But if we're overlooking qualified candidates, that is a problem. Now, typically, that's either going to be kind of a structural problem with the tools that they're actually using in the hiring process, or it's an implementation problem, meaning we created the right tools, but we haven't trained people how to use them correctly. Right? It's like is I don't know. Is there like a tool that's specifically used in cabling that everyone your audience would be familiar with? Kind of
Oh, yeah,
specific
yeah.
to
We
cabling.
got punch tools and all kinds of stuff.
Like a punch tool. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's like, if somebody has a really good punch tool, but the product isn't coming out the way we want, and go like, "Oh, this punch tool is broken." It's like, "Oh, the punch tool is probably not broken. You're just not using it very well, right?"
Right.
And in this question that we're getting from your audience member, we don't really know, is it a structural problem with the tools that they're using, or is it an implementation problem, meaning the person's not using the tool well? We don't have enough information. That being said, we can start to kind of lay out what a good process looks like, and hopefully a listener will be able to sort of sort through it a bit. Now, before you even go into the interview, in my field, probably the most important thing we would do is something called a job analysis. Now, if you've got 15, even 150 or 450 employees, you're probably not going to do a full blown job analysis like I might do if I was working for Amazon or Boeing or something like that. But what this process looks like is I follow somebody around for some period of time, maybe like a week or maybe even more, figure out all the work that they do and all the steps that they do to make their work kind of great, right? Hopefully working at a strong performer. Then I start to code how often they're doing those behaviors and how important are those behaviors, how much time do they spend doing those things. And we end up with a list of different performance characteristics, things that someone has to do well. This is the basis for all job interviews. If you don't have some version of a job analysis, your interview isn't going to be worth very much. Doesn't matter if it's tiered or if you're sitting down with someone for a day in interview. Doesn't matter. Now there's an abbreviated version of this. Right? This is what I'm going to suggest for the average person, and most companies are going to use even up to 150. You just sit down, maybe with someone who knows this role particularly well, and if you don't have someone internally, go external. Go talk to someone else that has that role. Ask them to identify 5 to 10 most important things that they do in their role. Then, second list, 5 to 10 things they spend most of their time doing. Now, there might be some things that are different on those two lists. That's why we're going to take the time to do both of them. Once you've got those down, then you can start creating an interview process that assesses each of those performance areas. And that's the most important thing for really any interview. Step one, figure out what the person's doing. Step two, figure out how to test if this candidate will be able to do a good job in the future.
I also want to put out there too that, and maybe you can give us just maybe how we can address this. There's a lot of bias in the decision process, and by bias I mean there's a lot of boomers, a lot of
Mhm,
millennial X's who don't
mhm,
understand how younger generations do things, and sometimes we may look at that differently and think that that person's not as qualified, right? Is there a
mhm.
way to kind of circumvent that?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about this and we're talking about kind of these gated or tiered phases, once you've got those performance areas or performance domains that you're looking at, then we might say, hey, the HR team is going to test, performance areas 1, 2, and 3. The hiring manager is going to test 4, 5, and 6. Right? And so we start to create kind of a deviation of, if they pass this, then we'll spend more time with them and see if they can pass the next round. But in terms of trying to remove that bias, it has to be a structured interview set that is assessing performance domains. We've already covered what those performance domains are and how to identify them for whatever role you're looking at. Second is a structured interview. And a structured interview means you're asking the same questions or you're providing the same tests to everybody that's applying for the role. You really can't deviate from it because you're no longer comparing sort of apples to apples. And if you haven't identified performance domains, that's the first area where you've got that sort of openness to bias. I go, this resume came in on pink paper. Like, I don't want someone that uses pink paper on their resume. Like that's not going to be a good fit for us. Like, did you identify that in your performance domain? So you only want to hire people that use white paper for their performance review or for
Right,
their resumes or whatever it is. They've got green hair. Doesn't matter if it's not showing up on the performance domain. I don't care, right?
right.
Or I haven't done a good job of identifying what I'm actually assessing for.
Well, a good application of that is when you because you said resumes, not
Mhm.
necessarily, a colored paper for resume, but the whole resume thing has changed over the last 15, 20 years. It used to be you have to send a two-page resume and you have to have, references and hobbies. Now they say a resume should be no more than one page, period.
Mhm.
Don't put your
Yep.
references. If we're so so you might have got somebody who was trained on how to do resumes the old way, and you might be bringing in some bias, thinking, well, here I got an old two-page resume. This must be a boomer or must
Yep.
be a millennial.
Yep.
or whatever the case may be. And it kind of helps remove that because, like you said, you didn't identify that as part of the structured interview
Y-
process. Is
And if
with the structured interview process, is there any leeway for additional questions, or must you just stick with the questions?
You're really going to stick to the questions in terms of the initial questions you ask. So you will still probably ask follow-up questions, but even those are going to be relatively contained. Your follow-up questions are going to fit usually into one of three categories: context, sort of background story about when they did this thing in their past, the action that they took. Sometimes people tell you, "Yeah, yeah, I'm really good at handling high volume of work." And like, okay, well, what do you actually physically do? So we force them to get specific about the behavior or action. And then the last part of it is the results. So, you might tell me you're really good at doing something, but how long does it actually take you to do that thing? Or what's your quality rate? Or how many times have you had to go back and repair something that you installed? So context, action, results, those generally are going to be follow-up questions. And really that should be it. If you're going, oh, that reminds me to ask you a question about another topic, uh, then
Oh
it's
yeah,
probably
inconsistency.
irrelevant. Yep,
It- it-
exactly.
yeah. So the next question that came in, and it kind of tied in with the bias, like you were just saying. So
Mhm.
the question was: We are a small company and treat each person we hire as a unique event. This inconsistency has led to subjective decisions instead of experience and qualifications. How can we make that process the same for every applicant? You kind of touched base a little bit by saying the structured interview, right? What
Mhm.
other things could do that?
Yep. So starting with a structured interview, and if you use that, then you can, if you stay within that structure, then you can start to find areas where you can deviate and try to create connection with people, right? Usually we want people to be relatively calm in the interview process because they're probably not feeling high stress, high social pressure when they're performing, I assume, right? In cabling, or even if someone's like in an office where they know the people in the environment. So I probably want to ask them maybe something like, how's the weather where you're at right now? Or how's the day been going for you? I still want to be careful because I might ask somebody how their day is going, and then they start to tell me about maybe some protected class information, right? They say like, "Oh, well, my kids," and I'm
Right.
going like, "Okay, well, they have kids. Is that going to be harder for them to do the job?" And this type of stuff. So, want to avoid, and now worth saying, I'm not going to give any legal advice. We want to stay to relatively neutral topics where people aren't going to tell you sort of their religion or something like that.
And that's one of the good things about having the structured questions because you can have them vetted ahead of time by legal counsel. And while it won't keep you 100% out of problems, but it'll certainly increase the chances of you not having to go to court, you know?
Absolutely, doing your due diligence there.
Exactly, exactly. And I love this next question, right? This next question says, when hiring technician installers, we can easily judge their technical skills by letting them punch down or even test a cable. But how can we test their soft skills like teamwork, communications, and problem solving? Because that's one of the things we just look at. Yeah, he can terminate, he can test, but is that the guy you really want in front of a customer?
My favorite way to kind of think about the hiring process is if you imagine, let's say you're the I don't know, like chief of police in Gotham City. Okay, are you creative here for a second? And every 10 years you get a new Batman, right? You get to hire your new Batman, right? And so you go, well, there's a whole set of things that we're looking for with Batman. Who is it we really want? Who are we looking for? Now the problem here is then usually people, instead of doing like the job analysis or some sort of shortened version of it that we talked about, they go straight to describing who Batman is, right? He's got to be really big on justice, and he's got to have a great chin, and this type of stuff. Well, kind of, and maybe, right? We want to work backwards. So we want to think about, okay, in let's say we hired the perfect Batman. A year from now, what has he done? Right? That's kind of our abbreviated version of a job analysis. It's all these activities and sort of success he's had in the role, how he's going to spend his time, etc. Then we start working backwards from there. You think about what are the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics Batman really needs to do those dream accomplishments. And those are all kind of nuanced a little bit. You could do a quick Google search on knowledge, skill, ability, other characteristics. And from there, then we can start going, okay, how do I figure out, does this person have the knowledge to do the job? Do they have the skill to do the job? So a work sample test would be one way to assess that. Maybe, and that's the technical aspects of the role. But the other side of it is soft skills. And so for Batman, we want good judgment, maybe, for example. Now, if you're using work sample to assess maybe like candy box or something, then we're going to use either a situational judgment test, or we're going to use something called behavioral interviewing prompts to assess more soft skill, something like judgment, for example. Now, usually this starts with something like, tell me about a time when you filled in the blank. This is going to be a behavioral sort of prompt. And then we're forcing them to tell us what they did in the past, assuming that's probably what they're going to do in the future. Right now, we want to come up with a good situation under which judgment is deployed in order for our implementation to go well. Right? It's like we know we want judgment, but are we actually assessing judgment? So I couldn't ask, for example, I don't know, tell me what you eat on a weekly basis. Like, what do you buy at the grocery store? That would be a bad prompt to figure out whether or not this person has good judgment.
Right.
Kind of, maybe does it a little bit, but not very well. So instead, I might ask something like, tell me about a time where you broke a rule because you thought it was the right thing to do. And then it'll start to give me a better assessment of like this person's case by case judgment.
I like that. You're being general in the question enough.
And the key is really to try to match it with what they will actually be doing on the job, right? So it's one thing to say good judgment. It's another thing to say in the performance of this role, judgment is used in these ways. Therefore, we're going to assess that specific application of judgment because judgment is so broad, right? Well, you could argue what the person buys at the grocery store is a sort of function of judgment, right? And it's like kind of, but not very specific to cabling. Yeah.
Yeah, because we're not always just doing cabling though. Like I said,
Mhm.
we're meeting with customers, we're meeting with contractors, we're meeting with engineers and stuff. And I've always said that everybody is a salesperson with their company, and that's why I said that's why you get paid the big bucks because
Yep.
I was working through what you said immediately after I said I really liked it. You can
Yeah.
fine tune it to the issues that you seem to have common problems with as a company
Mhm.
when dealing with customers or general contractors and stuff.
Yep. Yep.
I like that a lot. I really, really do. All right. So the next question, and I think this one, I can relate to this one way too much. It says, I own a small company of 5 to 10 employees. 6 of them are field staff. I struggle with making the final decision when I have multiple candidates that seem to be equally qualified for the role. And I will admit, I suffer from analysis paralysis in many decisions. That's
Yep.
me.
Yep.
What
Yep.
can I do to expedite a decision to get the right person?
Yep. It's a tricky question, to be honest. Now, probably dealing with something like paradox of choice. This is when you've got maybe a variety of options. And this one's particularly bad. And if you go grocery shopping, maybe with your partner, one of the two of you likely suffers from this, right? You go to the grocery store, one of you knows exactly what you want to get, you throw it in the cart, the other person looking, going like, yeah, let me just read the back of this box and let me take a look at the side of the box and okay, how does this fruit feel? Or and then and one of you gets frustrated, right? This is sort of paradox of choice. We've got so many options, and then it takes us a long time, and usually then we're more frustrated with the choice after the fact as well. So that could be challenging. Now, first, want to assume that both people sort of passed the structured interview tests that you've already created, the work sample tests you've created that are assessing the most important criteria. Now you've got a couple different options. Now, I'll tell you one of my favorite things I got from an advisor in graduate school. He said, you think you've got two choices or maybe three choices. Start flipping a coin, and best 3 out of 5 is going to get the job.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, the catch is you actually don't do best 3 out of 5. You start finding yourself cheering for one person more than the other. You go, okay, maybe I should hire that person. That's kind of if you want to use an intuitive sort of system, which again, you've already met the criteria for performance. So now you can kind of go by your own judgment call. Second part of this is start adding in additional criteria that you think might be useful or relevant. Now, for me personally, in this situation, I start looking at gaps on my team and what gaps I would like to fill. Right there's a sort of role that we need them to play, but maybe what we don't have is someone who's creative on our team. And it'd be nice if we had someone creative. And then I build another assessment, do one more interview with the two candidates that are remaining. Maybe it's just 15 minutes, figure out which of the two are more creative, hire that person. You could also do something for like more proactive. That's particularly useful when you've got a small business. So you can hire people that are more proactive, meaning they're more likely to skill up and learn by themselves once they're hired. And a quick way to do that is ask them to learn about maybe your industry or your company specifically, see what they can learn, then ask them what did they learn. And you can figure out which of those two more proactive.
Excellent. Excellent. I can see a lot of that advice not only being used as a hiring process, but I can see that being used by a technician in the field or a project manager using some of them same principles.
Yep.
I
Yep.
like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the next question, let me see. He says, "I'm good with interviewing and fleshing out technical abilities. I always seem to miss the red flags that bite me later? How can I tell if there's a problem with that gap in employment or lack of relevant experience?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Now, generally, this is a gap in the job analysis. So that's why I say everything kind of comes back to doing our due diligence there, figuring out exactly who it is that we're looking for. And what I'll tell you is either you're hiring for it, or you're training for it, or you're going to have a problem. So if you imagine we've identified all the great things that we're looking for in an ideal candidate, if we're not using our selection time, our hiring process to identify the person's good at the thing, and we know that once they're inside the company, we don't want to spend time training the person on this thing, then you're going to end up with a problem. If it's not showing up in the hiring, it's not showing up in the development. Now, alternative here is you can identify specifically red flags, meaning things you don't want to hire for. That's not going to show up in the job analysis, but you add it to the interview process. So, for example, something that I've had a hard time working with in the past is maybe like blaming behavior. So there's a problem with something. It's the sort of $2 psychology word for it is external locus of control. You go like, oh, there's a problem with the job. It wasn't me though, right? It was so hot outside, I couldn't stay there another hour. Or, my punch tool was broken. I don't know. I got to get a more expensive one. I start blaming things on other people or things outside of me, rather than taking responsibility for failures or problems that occurred. So I'll use that as a red flag question. I'll add that to an interview process. So if anyone doesn't pass that, it's an automatic disqualification. They're not going to make it to the next round. And the way I assess that, just to kind of make it practical for folks, I'll ask people, tell me about a time you're on a team that failed and what was your role on that team, right? And all they do is they talk about other people and why other people were the reason for the failure, they're probably not going to end up on my team.
Excellent advice, my friend. That's why I love having you on the show.
Happy to be here, man.
So, well, I do have some additional questions, but we've kind of run out of time for today. Would you mind coming back on in, I don't know, 6 months or so?
Happy to be here anytime I can. Anything that is helpful.
I'll feed you some of that good Bowser barbecue.
I'll take bribes easily, no problem.
and this time, the only difference is the pork won't be from the grocery store. The pork will be one that we farm, fresh pork.
That way we know it's
my
good.
barbecue.
Yeah, we know
you
it's
won't
good.
Get, because I know I told you this when I had you over. I told you that because I always test my food before I give it to people, and I told you it wasn't my best, and you were like, "Man, this is great." I'm like, I can do better.
That's a sign of excellence when we're our own toughest critic, for sure.
Yes. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Robleh. I appreciate having you, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me, and look forward to another one soon.
So if you enjoyed this style of content, shoot me a message, email me, let me know that you like this, and also let me know what subjects you would like to cover, because I think I might do this more often. Till next time, knowledge is power.
That's it for this episode of today's podcast. We hope you were able to learn something. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. Also, leave a rating so we can help even more people learn about telecommunications. Until next time, be safe.